And true to the words of the spirit of the dead woman, Mrs. Achibong became pregnant 18 months later after being barren for 10 years. She bore Ekemini and had 2 more children in the years that follow. Mr. Achibong has kept to his promise, but Mrs. Achibong is not, seeing that she now detests Abasiama. However, few days before the day, Abasiama was found lying by the side of the poor old beggar. Once upon a time, in a village called Ifyokekot, lived a girl called Abasiama. Abasiama was the first daughter and also the first child in a family with 4 children. Abasiama and her siblings live with their parents, Mr. and Mrs. Achibong. Mrs. Achibong, Abasiama's mother, treated her other 3 children with love, but she showed disdain towards Abasiama instead of loving her. She insults and scolds Abasiama for every little mistake. In fact, nothing Abasiama does pleases her, so the insults and scolding were constant. She made Abasiama do all the chores in the house. If Abasiama asked that her siblings assist with the chores, her mother would stop them. "You are the eldest, so you should do all the work," Mrs. Achibong would say. Abasiama complains to her father, and every time she complained, he would tell Abasiama to forgive her mother and just do her best to please her because she was only trying to make her strong. He told her that if she continued to do her best, her mother would have a change of heart. But that never happened. The more effort Abasiama puts, the more her mother's harsh treatment towards her grew. Later, Abasiama began to feel she was adopted. "Was I adopted? Am I truly your child?" she asked her father one day. And her father assured her that she was their biological child. Now, because of the way Mrs. Achibong treats Abasiama before the other children, Ekemini and Itoro, who are Abasiama's immediate younger siblings, began to disrespect Abasiama, which their mother also encouraged. Only Udo, who was the only male amongst them and last child, was kind, loved and respected Abasiama. One day, all 4 siblings were returning from the village town square where the youths and young people of the village had just had a meeting when they saw a poor old beggar lose his balance and fell. Abasiama and Udo rushed and helped the old beggar up. They noticed that he was hungry and was very weak. So Abasiama rushed home to get him food and some water while she asked Udo to stay behind to look after the old beggar. In all of this, Ekemini and Itoro watched in disgust. They reported the incident to their mother when they got home, and Abasiama was punished for taking food from the house to give to a stranger. However, this did not deter Abasiama, who kept taking food to the poor old beggar from time to time. Now, the prince of the village, Prince Anyekan, had just returned from his studies abroad and was going to take a bride. The queen and king liked the Achibong family and as such recommended the Achibong's daughters to their son, the prince. Luckily, Prince Anyekan was also ready to marry from the Achibong family. This is because he had seen Abasiama on a few occasions and had fallen in love with her. The king informed Mr. Achibong of his son's intention to marry Abasiama, and Mr. Achibong was very happy. However, Mrs. Achibong was not happy. "Why Abasiama? Why not Ekemini or Itoro?" she said angrily when her husband returned home that evening and informed her of what was supposed to be a good news. "But Abasiama is our first daughter, and it is only proper that she gets married first before Ekemini and Itoro. Moreover, it is Abasiama the prince also likes and wants to marry," Mr. Achibong responded. "Abasiama is not our daughter," Mrs. Achibong snapped. Well, she was right, because truly Abasiama was not their biological daughter. Many years ago, Mr. and Mrs. Achibong struggled to conceive in their early years of marriage. One evening, they were returning from another village where they had gone to see a herbalist because of their childless situation when they heard the sound of a baby crying in the bush. They traced the sound and found the baby lying beside a dead woman. After thinking and waiting for a few hours with no one coming to claim the baby and identifying the dead woman, Mr. and Mrs. Achibong picked the baby girl and took her home. That night, whilst they slept, Mr. and Mrs. Achibong both had the same dream. In the dream, the spirit of the dead woman appeared to them. She told them that she was on a journey when she got bitten by a snake and had also went into premature labor as a result of that. She begged that they look after her child and promised to ask Abasi, the creator and God of the universe, to open Mrs. Achibong's womb so she could bear her own children if she would look after her daughter. She begged also that they should never let her baby know that she was a child of a dead woman when they found her in the bush. Mr. and Mrs. Achibong woke up and realized that they had both had the same dream. They became eager and looked forward to having their own children, as the spirit of the dead woman said. In order to honor the spirit of the dead woman who had promised them that they would bear their own children, they made a promise to themselves not to ever let the baby know that she was picked and was not their biological child, and also to never mention it to any soul. They named the baby girl Abasiama, and true to the words of the spirit of the dead woman, Mrs. Achibong became pregnant 18 months later after being barren for 10 years. She bore Ekemini and had 2 more children in the years that follow. Mr. Achibong has kept to his promise, but Mrs. Achibong is not, seeing that she now detests Abasiama. Mrs. Achibong visited the palace and tried to discourage the queen and king from accepting the prince's choice. Abasiama is my daughter, but it will be unfair to my king and queen and to the kingdom at large if I keep quiet and allow the prince to marry her, because she has a bad character and she is not fit to be any man's wife at all, let alone a wife to our dear prince. My king, my queen, I am only doing my duty as a true and patriotic indigene of this village, Mrs. Achibong said. You should convince the prince to accept Ekemini, my second daughter. After all, she is also an Achibong and a better choice. As for now, I would continue to pray to the gods and do my best as a mother in order for Abasiama to change and be married someday, because she is still my daughter regardless, Mrs. Achibong said again, trying to sound concerned and faking a worried look. But the king and queen were wise, and so was the prince. They knew that no mother who truly loves her child like Mrs. Achibong claims she does would say such vile things about her child, and would choose to have the younger daughter marry the older one's suitor instead. This made them wonder and asked Mr. Achibong if truly Abasiama was their child, and Mr. Achibong still maintained that Abasiama was their child. Anyways, Prince Anyekan and his parents chose to proceed with the marriage plans with Abasiama, because they also know that Abasiama was a good girl and that all Mrs. Achibong said about her were not true. And so, a day was fixed for the customary rites and marriage ceremony between Abasiama and the prince. It was announced all over the village. However, few days before the day, Abasiama was found lying by the side of the poor old beggar in his old shack hut. They were seen by some youths and the village chief priest. Abasiama was dragged to the palace, accused of sleeping with the poor old beggar. The youths and the chief priest testifying to having caught her red-handed. The king and queen were disappointed at Abasiama and had cause to believe what Mrs. Achibong had told them initially. Abasiama pleaded and told everyone that she was innocent of the allegation, but the king and queen would not believe her because of the chief priest's testimony especially. Mrs. Achibong kept saying, "I told you people, but you would not listen to me." Everyone condemned Abasiama, and because of what had happened, the king was about to pronounce that the marriage plans between his son and Abasiama would no longer happen when the old beggar walked in. But this time, he wasn't dressed in his usual old and dirty clothes. He was different, as he wore a very neat and an expensive regalia. Abasiama and everyone recognized him, but they were surprised to see him looking different. More to their amazement was when the king stood up and embraced the old man and called him his friend. Also, Prince Anyekan greeted and addressed the man as uncle. Mr. Umbotidem and the king became bosom friends when they met in London many years ago during the course of their study. After their study, the king returned back to Nigeria and to the village to take over the rulership of his village, being that he was a crown prince then. But Mr. Umbotidem stayed back in London and visited Nigeria and his friend only a few times. And when Prince Anyekan also went to London for studies, he stayed with Mr. Umbotidem and his family because of the relationship the king has with Mr. Umbotidem. Mr. Umbotidem was from the next village, so after many years, he came back to Nigeria and back to his village. Mr. Umbotidem wishes that his son Essien marries a native, seeing that his son had had so many failed relationships in the past, and most of the girls were gold diggers, rude and unkind, or had an unpleasant character. He asked his son to pretend to be a poor beggar in order to find a good girl who would be kind and would look beyond his wealth and extend a hand of kindness even if he was a beggar. But his son was not interested in doing such. Mr. Umbotidem also suggests same thing to the king and Prince Anyekan when he learnt that they were also looking for a good wife for the prince. But the king and Prince Anyekan also did not buy into his suggestion. However, Mr. Umbotidem decided that he was going to do so because of his own son, and if he finds the kind of girl he wants for his son, he would later present the girl to his son. So, he disguised himself to be a poor old beggar without anybody's knowledge. He revealed this and told the king that Abasiama was a good girl with a kind heart, and that even if he couldn't get her for his own son, he wouldn't mind and would be happy to have Prince Anyekan marry her. Mr. Umbotidem told the king that earlier that afternoon, when Abasiama brought food to him like she had been doing, Mrs. Achibong and her daughter Ekemini, who had been trailing her from behind, suddenly appeared and blew a white substance on them that made them fall asleep immediately and unconscious. Mr. Umbotidem assured the king that nothing happened between Abasiama and himself. The chief priest, however, kept insisting that Mr. Umbotidem was lying and that he saw Mr. Umbotidem and Abasiama having a carnal knowledge. However, while he spoke, he was suddenly hit by an invisible hand. It was the spirit of Abasiama's real mother who had struck him. The chief priest confessed that Mrs. Achibong had bribed him and had also promised to give him more gifts so he could support her. Mrs. Achibong, having been exposed, confessed to her crime and to bribing the other youths who had dragged Abasiama to the palace. In her confession, she said that she suddenly started despising Abasiama, especially when everyone referred to her as the first daughter of her family instead of Ekemini, her own biological child. and that she felt stuck because of the promise between her and her husband. She pleaded that Abasiama forgives her for being foolish and for how she had treated her in the past. Abasiama felt bad after learning that she had suffered maltreatment because she was not their biological daughter after all. But she released forgiveness and still accepted Mrs. Achibong as her mother and Ekemini as her sister still. The chief priest was banished from the village for compromising his values, accepting bribe, and falsely accusing the innocent. And as for the youths who were part of the conspiracy, they were punished severely and made to work hard in people's farm. Abasiama and Prince Anyekan got married and they lived happily ever after. The end. I hope you enjoyed the story and have learned a thing or two from it. I would love to know. Please leave a comment. Thank you for watching and see you in our next video. Bye.